And while this is not absolute proof, the data suggest a near certain likelihood, 99.999999824%, that Christianity's prophetic foundation is true. Hey, welcome back, everybody. So I thought I'd just share something today that I've been working on for my kids, really. So as we take my kids through Bible study, I tend to like try to pull in as much like outside sources to validate that what they're reading is things that took place in history and can be confirmed by science or history or archaeology, and build the picture of this humongous mountain of data that basically exists to support the Word of God. So I had put together this pitch basically about, Christianity. Do we have blind faith, or is there actual evidence to support our faith? And basically broke it up into a number of different categories. So there's the moral arguments in favor of Christianity. There's the philosophical arguments. There's the scientific evidence. There's the historical evidence. There is the evidence of prophecy and the mathematical probabilities of those being true or false. And then just wrapping it up with, like, why does all of this matter? Why does it matter if we believe in Christianity and all this evidence is there to support it? So I put this together for them. I thought I'd share it with you and just walk you through kind of summaries of each one of these major categories. So the first one being the moral argument. So start off by asking, what is the most important question in the world? And the most important question is, does God exist? I mean, does he actually exist? And if he does, has he revealed himself in any way? And if he has, what has he said, and what does that mean for us? So to look at this, we have to look at objective morality versus moral relativism versus flawed morality of other faiths. So these three arguments, objective moral values and moral transformation and moral accountability, work together to support Christianity's truth by addressing different aspects of morality. So those different aspects are objective moral grounds, morality and God's nature, and that provides a metaphysical basis of truth. And then you have moral transformation, demonstrating Christians' practical power to align human behavior with divine ideals. And then the third thing is you have this moral accountability argument, which satisfies the human need for justice, pointing to a divine moral order. So objective morality, what is that? So overview-wise, this argument, notably articulated by philosophers like C.S. Lewis, William Lane Craig, etc., posits that the existence of objective moral values and duties, moral truths that are binding, regardless of human opinion, is best explained by the existence of a moral lawgiver, a God as described by Christianity. So in other words, there are certain moral things that all humans universally recognize to be true. And if we all recognize those things to be true, well, where does that law come from? Because a moral law isn't necessarily defined by the laws of like nature or science. So it only makes sense in the lens of an objective moral God existing. So humans universally recognize certain moral principles. Murder is wrong, love is good. Those are as objectively true and not merely subjective preferences. So you need these objective moral truths to have a moral foundation. Objective moral values require a transcendent source beyond human or natural processes as a naturalistic explanation, i.e., evolution cannot account for moral behavior, but not for the obligation to follow it. So the implications for Christianity's truth is, if objective morality exists and requires a divine source, Christianity's conception of God as a moral lawgiver supports its truth over atheistic relativistic worldviews that struggle to ground objective morality. You can see that in our modern cultures. Like, moral relativism is a poison that is destroying many Western cultures because they've walked away from this idea of objective morality. So then you have the moral transformation argument. And the moral transformation argument, summarized is basically the Holy Spirit and God and belief in Jesus Christ actually transforms people internally, morally. So overview, Christianity's truth is supported by its unique ability to transform individuals morally and foster virtues that align with human flourishing, suggesting a divine design behind its ethical teaching. This argument emphasizes the practical, experiential impact of Christian morality. Transforming powers, you can look through history and see that Christianity has done that. Most notably, possibly being the abolition of slavery, at least for the modern reader. You can see it in people like Saul. You see it in the teachings of Jesus, and the complete moral transformation of pagan cultures from like a Roman society that had vastly different moral framework than a Christian society, and Christianity being able to transform that society at its core. The moral coherence portion of this, Christian ethics rooted in love for God and neighbor, provide a cohesive framework that balances justice, mercy, and personal responsibility, leading to a transformation of your life. And the evidence of truth, then, the ability of Christian teachings to produce virtuous lives and societal reform. I.e., examples, things like charity, hospitals, human rights, they all came about because of Christianity, and they align with this divine moral order concept, supporting, not proving, but supporting Christianity's claimed truth. And lastly, we have moral accountability and justice. So the overview here is that the argument posits that Christianity's doctrine of divine judgment and eternal consequences, heaven and hell, provides the best explanation for the human longing for justice and moral accountability, suggesting that its worldview is true. So humans have a desire for justice. We see things being done wrong, and we want the person to be punished. We see someone have something wrong done to them, and we want justice for them. Christianity's solution to this was to teach that God is just and will ultimately hold everybody accountable. The existence of hell and heaven ensures that moral actions have eternal significance, satisfying the human sense that justice must prevail. The implication for truth here is the coherence of Christianity's moral framework, where free will leads to eternal consequences, suggests a divine moral order that aligns with reality. If there is no ultimate justice, morality loses its weight, but Christianity's promise of divine judgment supports its truth. So these are, the sort of beginning arguments for the evidence in support of Christianity, the thinking kind of arguments, the ones where you have to use logic and rationality, and you start to come to this idea, a God, there must be a God, because these things are real and they are true, and they must come from a source other than nature and science and history. So that's how we start this to build the mountain here. All right, now we'll look at the philosophical arguments. So the philosophical arguments fall into three categories that we'll talk about. So the cosmological, theological, and ontological. But the point of philosophical arguments is, for the truth of Christianity, the aim is to demonstrate that its core claims, such as the existence of God, the divinity of Jesus, and the coherence of its worldview, are rational, and they align with human reason and experience. These arguments often focus on theism broadly, but can be tailored to support Christianity specifically by connecting some of its unique doctrines. So these three categories, cosmological, these arguments attempt to establish a first cause of the universe, basically, aligning with Christianity's creator God view. Then you have teleological arguments that points to purposeful design, consistent with Christianity's view of a meaningful universe. And then you have ontological, which affirms a necessary perfect being, matching the God revealed in Christianity. So let's look at cosmological. So the overview of this then, the argument, rooted in works like philosophers like Thomas Aquinas, William and Craig, more modern example, posit that the universe existence requires a first cause, which Christianity identifies as the personal, which is important, transcendent God revealed in Jesus Christ. So what are these key points of this? So premise 1, everything that begins to exist has a cause. And premise number 2 then, the universe began to exist, supported by scientific evidence, like the Big Bang and philosophical arguments against like infinite regress. Conclusion, therefore, is that the universe has a cause, which must be an uncaused, eternal, and necessary being identified as God. So, as an example, the Big Bang, something doesn't come from nothing. So the Big Bang posits that there was nothing, and then a giant explosion happened, and the whole universe came into being. Well, what caused the explosion? That would be God, the causer of all things. Then you have the teleological argument. So this argument, advanced by people like William Paley, and includes things like the fine-tuning of the universe that we will look at, asserts that the universe's order, complexity, and fine-tuning for life suggest a purposeful, intelligent design, which aligns with Christianity. Premise number 1, then, the universe exhibits a parent design, such as fine-tuning of physical constants, and we're going to look at 5 of those, I think. And then premise number 2, design is best explained by an intelligent, purposeful cause rather than by chance or necessity. For example, when we look at computer code, we automatically know that an intelligent designer created it. It wasn't something that just came about by random purpose. So, conclusion then, a purposeful, intelligent designer exists, and that is consistent with the Christian God who created an ordered universe. Another example is DNA, and we'll look at DNA as well. Then you have the ontological argument. So this overview contends that the very concept of a greatest conceivable being, God, implies his existence, which Christianity identifies as the God of the Bible. So premise number 1 then, God is defined as the greatest conceivable being, possessing all perfections, omnipotence, omniscience, moral perfection, etc. So premise number 2 then, a being that exists in reality is greater than one that exists only in the mind. The conclusion, therefore, then, if God is the greatest conceivable being, he must exist in reality, as a non-existent God would be less great. This also aligns with Christians' description of a maximally great being. All right, so now let's look at some of the scientific evidence that supports those arguments. So firstly, the Big Bang. So Genesis 1:1, in a finite universe, the biblical claim, ultimately that God created the universe ex nihilo, meaning out of nothing, meaning it having a definite beginning. This implies a finite universe with a starting point in time. Big Bang alignment, the Big Bang theory supports this. There's evidence like cosmic, microwave, background radiation, redshift, posits that the universe began approximately 13 billion years ago. The finite beginning aligns with the biblical notion of a universe with a starting moment, contrary to earlier scientific views of an eternal, steady state universe. I remember actually when the Big Bang was kind of getting public popularity or awareness, at least when I was a kid, and like hearing that it was kind of contentious, that because scientists didn't want to believe it was true because it actually gave credibility to Christianity. That's, that was like 25, 30 years ago or something like that. So my memory, I'm sure, is a little hazy, but I sort of remember that. And then you have order and purpose out of creation. Genesis 1, of course, also aligns with that. Big Bang theory also aligns with that as well. Transcendent cause, the biblical claim, Genesis attributes creation to a transcendent personal God who exists outside of time and space, acting intentionally to bring the universe into being. The Big Bang requires a cause. This is important. It requires a cause beyond the physical universe, as space-time and matter begin at the singularity. So this also aligns with the Christian view of a non-physical eternal God as the cause, as opposed to a naturalistic explanation that struggled to account for the origin of the singularity. So again, we're looking at the mountain. We're seeing how big the mountain is, and we're starting from the moral arguments, then we're looking at the cosmological, now we're drilling down into some of the more specific scientific stuff, all of these things pointing to a God. Then you have the fine-tuning of the universe, which is also quite compelling. So This basically says that cosmological constants are fixed numerical values in the laws of physics that determine how the universe operates. Key examples include gravitational constant, covers the strength of gravity affecting star and planet formation. So these are the four here we're going to look at. The cosmological constant influences the universe's expansion rate, critical for galaxy formation. Then we're going to look at the electromagnetic force constant, which regulates interactions between charged particles essential for chemistry and life. Then we're going to look at the strong nuclear force constant, which holds atomic nuclei together, enabling stable atoms, and the weak nuclear force constant, which governs processes like radioactive decay, which are crucial for stellar nucleosynthesis. Which, I'm not a scientist, and I'm not trying to drill deep down into these explaining. I'm just giving like overviews of the evidence. So the scientific evidence of cosmological constant. What Christians argue here is that the precision points to a purposeful, intelligent design by God. This basically aligns with the teleological argument, which supports the Big Bang's compatibility with big creation and complements the moral and eschatological themes discussed earlier. The constant's fine-tuning suggests a universe intentionally designed for human existence. Again, reinforcing Christians' claim, not proving it. So the gravitational constant. So the gravitational constant is fine-tuned to within 1 part in 10 to the 60th, which means that a change as small as that absurdly small number there would disrupt the universe's life-permitting structure. I mean, just think about that. Like, if it's off by whatever that 1% is, like, life-permitting gravitational forces would cease to exist and there would be no life. So if stronger, gravity would be too intense, causing stars to form too quickly and burn out rapidly, preventing stable planetary systems, and planets would collapse into their stars and life-sustaining environments would not form. If weaker, gravity would be too weak to form stars and galaxies, as matter would not coalesce sufficiently. Without stars, there'd be no energy or heavy elements, etc., necessary for life. So incredibly fine-tuned. The cosmological constant description here. The constant governs the universe's expansion rate, counteracting gravity to determine whether the universe expands, contracts, or remains stable. So fine-tuning argument. So Stephen Meyer, I reference a lot of his work in this. So Meyer references works by physicists like Leonard Susskind, noting that the cosmological constant is fine-tuned to within 1 part in 10 to the 120th. Extraordinarily precise value. A slight deviation would prevent galaxy formation. So the consequences of deviation: if larger, the universe would expand too rapidly, preventing matter from clumping into galaxies and stars or planets, so no structures capable of life would form. And if smaller, the universe would collapse back on itself shortly after the Big Bang, before stars and planets could form, making life impossible. Another just incredibly fine-tuned constant that without it being so intelligently crafted, that life would be impossible. Strong nuclear force constant. So this constant determines the strength of force that binds protons and neutrons in atomic nuclei, enabling stable atoms. So again, Stephen Meyer, citing John Barrow and Frank Tripler, showing the strong nuclear force is fine-tuned to within 1 part of 10 to the 50th, a small change disrupting nuclear stability. So the consequences of this: if it was stronger, nuclei would bind too tightly, preventing the formation of complex elements like carbon and oxygen, essential to life. And stars would produce insufficient heavy elements. And if weaker, protons and neutrons would not bind effectively, preventing the formation of stable atoms. Without stable nuclei, chemistry and life could not exist. Then we have the last one, the electromagnetic force constant. This constant governs the strength of the electromagnetic interactions between charged particles, critical for chemical bonding and molecular structures necessary for life. So again, Stephen Meyer notes the electromagnetic force is fine-tuned within a range of 1 part in 10 to the 40th, ensuring chemical stability. So if it was too strong, chemical bonds would be too rigid, preventing the flexible molecular interactions needed for biological processes like DNA replication. If weaker, bonds would be too weak, making molecules unstable, preventing the formation of complex organic compounds required for life. So then we have the initial entropy of the universe as another example. So the parameter here of this refers to the universe's initial state of low entropy or disorder at the Big Bang, which allowed for the formation of structured systems like galaxies and stars. So again, Stephen Meyer, drawing on Roger Penrose, came up to this fine-tune within a part of 1 to the 10 to the 10 to the 123rd power. A number so unimaginably small, we can't even really grasp what it is. So if higher, initial entropy would result in a chaotic, disordered universe without the gradients needed for stars, planets, or life. The universe would be a uniform soup of particles. If lower, an even lower entropy is less problematic but unnecessary, as the current value is already optimized for life-permitting structures. So that's a crazy number. So the entropy of the universe, the disorder at the beginning, if it was any different, life could not exist as well. So summary of the fine-tuning parameters. So Meyer, putting together all of this together, comes up with this astronomically low 1 in 10 to the 10th to the 123rd for entropy alone. That's just entropy. Makes the chance of an implausible explanation compared to intelligent life. Basically what he's saying here is it's math is saying that it's virtually a certainty that the universe was intelligently designed. That's his argument. So physical necessity then, there's no evidence that these parameters must have their current values. Their contingency suggests that they could have been different, supporting the design hypothesis. So in other words, there's no scientific mathematical law that says these things had to be the way they are. They could have been any other myriad number of different parameters or constant. They're going to come out with any number of ways that they could have differed, but they didn't. And because they didn't, that suggests that it was intelligently designed. So the Christian connection, so Meyer again aligns the fine-tuning evidence with the Christian doctrine of a purposeful, intelligent God who created a life-permitting universe. And this also supports the teleological argument and the Big Bang's alignment with Genesis from our earlier pages. The cumulative case here, Meyer integrates fine-tuning with other evidence like biological complexity, information in the DNA, that to argue Christianity's worldview with a purposeful, intelligent designer best explaining the universe's structure, and we're going to look at those too. All right, so let's continue on with some more of the teleological arguments. So DNA, as an example. So DNA is basically just digital information encoded in biology, right? So it is responsible for building proteins and directing life's processes, and it exhibits characteristics of specified complexity, a hallmark of intelligent design. There are no known naturalistic mechanisms, e.g. evolution or chemical processes, that can explain the origin of DNA, making intelligent cause the best explanation. DNA is maybe the best evidence for intelligent design and God in the entire universe, in my opinion. So this complements the fine-tuning of the cosmological constants earlier by extending intelligent design into the biological realm, and the biological realm being, perhaps the more important part of the realm, because that's where life and consciousness exists. So the argument then is that this specified complexity, being a hallmark of intelligent design, is seen in human artifacts like computer code, language, etc. So DNA's information content is analogous to a software program, suggesting an intelligent source rather than a random process. So what is the evidence? The human genome consists of about 3 billion base pairs arranged in a precise sequence codes for thousands of proteins. The probability of such sequence arising by chance is astronomically low. And Meyer, again, his calculations say 1 in 10 to the 150th for functional protein sequences. So again, suggesting an enormously high probability that this thing must be intelligently designed. So then you have irreducibly complex mechanisms, which is also something that I really was like not aware of until, Stephen Meyer started putting out some of his books. But this is another incredible example of why evolution, for example, we'll get to evolution, but why it couldn't possibly work. Because, a cell, there are enough mechanisms, enough protein machines inside of a cell that it could not possibly have arisen through natural processes or chemical processes. So the description that argues that DNA directs the assembly of molecular machines, those associated with ribosome, ATP, synthase, etc., that exhibit irreducibly complex systems where all parts are necessary for function, making gradual evolutionary assembly implausible, really impossible, if you ask me. The argument, the interdependence of DNA, which codes for these proteins, and the molecular machines which translate the DNA, create a chicken and egg problem. Both must exist simultaneously for life to function, suggesting that a purposeful design rather than stepwise evolution. So what's the evidence then again? Ribosome, which translates the DNA code into protein, requires over 50 proteins and RNA components. All are precisely coordinated. Removing any part of the system disables the system, and that refutes the idea of gradualism. So what are the consequences of naturalistic failure? So natural selection cannot explain the origin of these systems before life exists. As selection acts on living, reproducing organisms, it does nothing to design the code itself. Chemical evolution theories, the RNA world, lack empirical support for generating this kind of complexity. So the Christian implication again, the irreducible complexity of DNA, dependent systems points to a single intelligent act of creation, resonating with the Genesis account discussed in our previous exchange. So evolution. So then we get to evolution. Everybody wants to act like evolution is this like foregone conclusion that it's been proven. It absolutely has not been. So there's three major arguments against it. You can, if you're not a Christian, you can throw out the first one, but it's one of them. Biblical incompatibility. Then there's the insufficiency of naturalistic mechanisms and the lack of evidence, i.e. transitional fossils. So these three things together form a robust case against it. Biblical incompatibility prioritizes scriptural authority, arguing that Genesis' account of direct creation conflicts with evolution's gradualism. Fine, you can reject that if you want, but there it is. Insufficiency of mechanisms per Meyer challenges evolution's scientific plausibility, highlighting the complexity of DNA in biological systems as evidence in design. And then one that I think is very compelling is the lack of transitional fossils. This questions the empirical support pointing to evolution, as in the gaps in the fossil record and the rapid appearance of life forms in the Cambrian explosion as evidence for a designed origin. So I threw this one in here just because this scientific evidence for a global flood. The global flood for the longest time was one of the biggest challenges I had to my faith in Christianity. Like I just couldn't figure out how it could be true. And it just didn't seem like there was any science being done. It was almost like Christian scientists had just written off even trying to prove it. Like I personally just could not find anything. And it was a huge challenge to my faith. Well, it turns out, there are plenty of scientists out there who think that the global flood did happen and have evidence. The problem is the research is pretty boring, and the videos are kind of hard to get through, and the books are all kind of hard to read. So nobody really knows about it. It doesn't get popularized. But I recently went down the rabbit hole in this one, and I thought there was a number of things that I was really unaware of that make a fairly compelling case for there being a global flood. So we're going to look at the fossil evidence that suggested it as possibility. There's these global uniformity of geological layers. There's plate tectonics, water from the deep suggestion, and then creation of coal and oil deposits. So again, a lot of these are very technical. I'm not going to go deep into them. This is just kind of like an overview of some of these. So the claim for fossil evidence. So the presence of billions of well-preserved fossils in sedimentary rocks worldwide indicate rapid burial during a global flood. Fossils, including delicate structures like jellyfish and ichthyosaurs, with preserved soft tissue or embryos, require a rapid burial to avoid decay or scavenging, which is extremely rare under normal conditions and requires some kind of catastrophic event. So massive fossil graveyards are strong indication of a cataclysm that buried these things. So massive accumulations such as the Karoo Formation in Africa, containing 800 billion vertebrate remains, or the Montesquieu-les-Mines mines in France, mixing marine and terrestrial species, suggest catastrophic burial by water. These graveyards span continents and include diverse species consistent with global floods sweeping across different ecosystems. Additionally, there have been over 250 fossils discovered with soft tissue, blood, feathers, etc. that are supposedly 50 plus million years old. This is not possible. Like, these things could not have survived in the millions and millions of years. They have like blood vessels and things like that from Tyrannosaurus Rex. You know, they could not have lasted that long. Could not have. However, if there was a cataclysm thousands of years ago in the past that buried these things, then they could have soft tissue and blood vessels and things like that preserved. So the very fact that these fossils exist with this soft tissue in dinosaurs suggests that they're much younger than we think they are. So then there's the uniformity of geological layers across continents. I'm not going to go deep into this one. You can read the slide if you want, but there's mega sequence layers, there's rapid deposition indicators, and there's cross-continental transport, sediments, et cetera, et cetera. You can look into these. I mean, just understand that the creationists argue here that these huge layers point to what they claim indicate a rapid global deposition by floodwaters, not a millions of years long process. Then we have plate tectonics and this idea of waters from the deep. So Genesis 7:11 describes the fountains of the great deep breaking up, suggesting subterranean waters sources contributed to the flood. So there are creation scientists out there like Tim Clary who argue that catastrophic plate tectonics during the flood released vast water volumes and molten rock which caused the ocean floors to raise and the flooding in the continents. So these plate tectonics, the breakup of the Earth's crust, leaves water and lava with new ocean floors, less dense due to heat, rising up, by up to 3,500 feet, pushing sea levels to cover continents. As floors cooled, then the water receded into deeper ocean basins. So what's the evidence for this? The evidence is that there are marine fossils on high mountains. Continental plateaus indicate oceans once covered these areas. Creationists argue this supports the global flood rather than the slow tectonic uplift. Again, these are pretty, like I said, they're pretty dry. Then you have coal and oil deposits. So this is interesting because creationists basically say that these deposits found globally must have formed rapidly during the flood, as vegetation and organic matter were buried under heat and pressure from flood sediments, not over millions of years. So coal beds, for example, in Australia, Antarctica, India, South America, contain similar plant fossils, suggesting a rapid burial of vast forests by floodwater. Oil formation, for example, floodwaters are volcanic activity, flattened forests, burying organic matter under sediment with heat and subterranean waters, forming oil and coal rapidly. And then the cyclothems, repeating patterns of coal, limestone, etc. So if you don't understand any of this stuff, I'm not surprised. I had never heard any of this stuff either. All right, so I mean, there's more stuff that I could talk about with the flood stuff, in terms of like, the scab lands showing evidence of like huge catastrophic like water flows, things like that. So, but I just put that in there because from a science perspective, the evidence for that was always pretty scant, I used to think. Now I'm kind of walking that back. I used to think that fossils were like big time evidence of evolution and millions of years and things like that. And the fact that they have demonstrated in a lab that they can make a fossil in like a month under lab conditions, and it doesn't take hundreds of years or whatever to develop them, and that it requires rapid burial now has me leaning more towards the catastrophe of the flood being the creation source for most of them. So anyway, so now we've taken all those previous arguments. We've looked at the moral stuff. We looked at the cosmological stuff. We looked at the scientific evidence. All of that stuff is doing what? It's pointing us to saying, okay, yeah, there's a lot of evidence for God existing, and there's a lot of evidence for order in the universe and intelligent design. So we have this framework now of the base of our mountains is showing us, yeah, there is a lot of evidence for God. Well, okay, that doesn't prove Christianity. It doesn't give us any like direct evidence for Christianity. So the next question that we have to ask ourselves is, has God made himself known to us? Has he injected into the history of the world? And the Bible is an incredible example of God intervening directly with humans in the history of the world. So, but how do we know we can trust it, right? I mean, it's written, over thousands and thousands of years by numerous different authors. Much of history is like lost. What kind of evidence is there that we have a reliably transmitted, recorded Bible that actually aligns very accurately with the evidence that out there that we have in archaeology? So that's what we're going to look at next is there reliability of the Bible? Does it align with the history that we can see outside of it, and does it align with archaeology? And we're going to look at these major categories across the history of Israel. So there's the Exodus and the conquest. What evidence is there for that? The monarchy, the Syrian and Babylonian period, the intertestamental period, the New Testament period, evidence for Jesus and his divinity, and then preservation of the scriptures themselves, like how reliable they are. So first, and again, I'm not going to go deep into these. This is an overview, but these are a couple of examples of archaeological evidence that we have that points to the Exodus and the conquest actually happening. You have the Merneptah stele. I'm sure I'm saying it's wrong. The Merneptah stele. The Egyptian monument mentions Israel from about 1208 BC, providing evidence for them being in the land. You have the Tel El Amarna letters, 1350 BC. Diplomatic texts from Egypt mention a group called the Habiru, possibly linked to the Hebrews, and describe Canaanite city-states under pressure, aligning with Joshua's conquest. You have the Jericho and Hazor destruction layers in archaeology. Excavations at Jericho show destruction layers of approximately 1400 to 1200 BC, aligning with the Joshua narrative. All these things are debated, of course, but there is history and archaeology out there to demonstrate that the Exodus and conquest happened. And there's more than this. I'm just throwing in kind of some of the big ones. But what is the major message from God? If this is historically accurate and this is God intervening in the world at this time, and we have some history and archaeology to prove that, then what is the major message God is giving to us as he's basically reintroducing himself to humanity at this moment? And the major message in these scriptures is that God is a powerful, personal deliverer who desires to dwell with his chosen people. He is faithful to his promises and wants a restored, correct relationship with sinful, fallen people. And he starts that process by picking out the Israelites and making a covenant with them and coming to dwell amongst them. All right, so then As you move through that period, you get into the early monarchy period. So the historical context, these are the books of Samuel and Kings, describe a unified Israelite kingdom under Saul, David, and Solomon. What is the archaeological evidence? Well, there's the Tel Dan stele from the 9th century. This is an Aramaic inscription that mentions the House of David, providing the earliest extra-biblical reference to David's dynasty. I remember, even just in like the last 100 years, there was an academic debate about whether David, or the House of David even existed, or if it was completely legendary. And then the discovery of this Tel Dan stele, put that to bed, as it confirms the existence of the house, at least. Then you have large-scale structures, excavations at Jerusalem, Hazor, Megiddo, Gezer, I'm sure I'm saying it wrong, reveal monumental architecture, city gates, walls from 10th century BC associated with Solomon's building projects, et cetera, et cetera. You also have the Shishak's invasion, 925 BCE, recorded in 1 Kings 14. Records an Egyptian invasion under Shishak, Pharaoh Shoshank I. His Bubasite portal at Karnak lists the conquered Canaanite cities, corroborating the biblical account. So during this period, what is God? What is his intervention with humans? What is he trying to tell us about himself? The major message from God in this period is that God is and should be your king. He desires your obedience over sacrifice and is faithful and loving to his people and wants people to be the same. So if we can reliably trust the history and archaeology of what is being told in these books, then we should also, by extension, be able to reliably entrust the words that God is speaking to us about his nature and what he wants from us. Then we get into the divided monarchy period. So historically, the kingdoms of Israel and Judah interacted with regional powers like Syria, Babylon, and Egypt as they divided between the two kingdoms of Israel and Judah. The archaeological evidence, you have the Misha stele from 840 BC. This is a Moabite inscription that mentions King Misha's rebellion against Israel and references the house of David, again supporting the biblical narrative. You have the black obelisk of Shalmaneser III depicts Jehu, king of Israel, as paying tribute to Assyria, confirming that an Israelite king exists. You have the Sennacherib's prism, which describes Assyrian king Sennacherib's campaign against Judah and Hezekiah's resistance. It confirms the siege of Jerusalem, though it does omit the biblical claim of divine deliverance. And then you have the Shalom inscription from 700 BC, found in Hezekiah's tunnel in Jerusalem, and it describes the construction of a water channel, which aligns with the biblical account as well. And the major message from God in this period is that God is faithful to his covenant and calls his people to return to him. Their persistent disobedience is going to lead to their judgment, but hope remains through God's promises of restoration and a coming righteous king. So God's continuing to communicate through the Bible with people in a way that we can trust reliably based off of corroboration with history and archaeology. Then you have the exile and return period. So the Babylonian chronicles, these cuneiform texts confirm Nebuchadnezzar's conquest of Jerusalem in 597, 586 BC, aligning with the Second King's narrative. You have the Cylinder of Cyrus, which describes Persian King Cyrus's policy of allowing exiled persons to return, supporting Ezra 1:1 account of the Jewish return. And you have Yehud seals. The Persian period seals and coins from Judea confirm the reestablishment of a Jewish province as described in Ezra and Nehemiah. You have the Lachish letters. Ostraca from Lachish describes conditions before Jerusalem's fall, consistent with Jeremiah's warnings. And the major message during this period is God disciplines his people for their unfaithfulness, but he never abandons them. He restores those who repent, and he remains faithful to his covenant, offering hope through a future renewal, a new covenant, and a coming king. So that gets us through basically the Old Testament. There's the intertestamental period, which is always talked about being kind of like a quiet, where God spoke or God didn't speak. And now you get into this New Testament period. All right, so now in the New Testament area, do we get into, continue? Do we see a continuation of the same kind of historical reliability? Does it get better? What ultimately is the difference? So as we get into the New Testament, again, I'm not focused on theology or Christology or anything. We're just looking at the evidence here. So we know Pontius Pilate existed, for example, because we found the Pontius Pilate inscription, 2636 CE, found in the Caesarea Maritima, limestone slab bearing his name and title as the Roman prefect of Judea. Obviously, he is the prefect who put Jesus to death. Then we have the Caiaphas ossuary, which was discovered in 1990 in Jerusalem. An ornate bone box is inscribed with Joseph, son of Caiaphas, likely the high priest who presided over Jesus' trial. And we have Herod's building projects. The New Testament mentions King Herod the Great and his successors, and there's a lot of archaeological remains of Herod's constructions, such as the Second Temple in Jerusalem, the Herodium, and Masada, confirming his wealth and influence. There's crucifixion evidence that we have a lot of. There's 1968 discovery in Jerusalem of a heel bone pierced by a nail, and the Johannan's ossuary confirms crucifixion practices existed in the first century Judea, matching New Testament descriptions. There is the pool of Bethesda and Siloam, which were excavated archaeologically. And John describes the pool of Bethesda with 5 porticos, which people thought was couldn't be true. I remember hearing this argument that, oh well, John, he got it wrong. There's no such thing as a pool with 5 porticos. So clearly he wasn't an eyewitness. And then they excavated this pool and it had 5 porticos, which was an unusual feature, confirming that he was in fact an eyewitness to this. And then you have the inscriptions of early Christians. There's all kinds of these early Christian symbols, fish, the Cairo, inscriptions in catacombs in Rome in 2nd and 3rd century, reflecting the rapid spread of Christianity. So then we have our historical, our non-biblical historical sources. So you have Josephus, who wrote Antiquities of the Jews. Josephus, if you don't know, was a Jewish historian. He was eventually taken in by Rome after they conquered Masada, and became a historian for the emperor, and he wrote his Antiquities. And he describes Jesus as a wise man crucified under Pontius Pilate, associated with Christians, while they think that parts of his writings were partially altered by later Christian scribes. Most scholars accept a core authentic reference to Jesus. You have a reference to James, the brother of Jesus, in Antiquities. It mentions the execution of him, corroborating the New Testament. You have Tacitus's Annals. This Roman historian described Christians as followers of Christus, executed under Pilate during Tiberius' reign, all aligning with the narrative. You have Suetonius's Lives of Caesars, mentioning Christus causing disturbance among Jews in Rome, likely referring to Christ and early Christians, consistent with Acts. And then you have Pliny the Younger's letters describing early Christians' worship of Christ as a god in Bithynia, confirming the New Testament's portrayal of early Christians' Christian devotion. Then we also have, while these are not necessarily a direct reflection of the New Testament themselves, the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were discovered in 1947, and I'm bringing these up in the New Testament because they're relevant to the reliability of prophecy. But the Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered between 1947 and 1956 in Qumran, near the Dead Sea, are a collection of Jewish texts written primarily between 250 and 68 CE. So all of the Old Testament text, written in Hebrew, Aramaic, and some Greek. So we know that all the prophecies that were written in the Old Testament about the Messiah were in fact written down before Jesus' coming. So we have copies of them, of those books, and we have copies of those prophecies being written down before his coming, so not altered after his coming. So we do the radiocarbon dating and paleography place the scrolls between the 3rd century and 1st century, predating or contemporaneous with Jesus in the early church. And why is this relevant to the New Testament? Like I said, Old Testament reliability. Okay, and then, well, I know this is controversial. This is, in fact, evidence. There is the Shroud of Turin. And the Shroud of Turin, long written off by me and most people as a forgery has new scientific evidence, a bunch of it, that seems to confirm its authenticity and seems to be, in fact, an unforgeable item that was, in fact, the burial cloth of Jesus. So why do we know this? So there's the image formation mystery. So if anybody's not seen Dr. David Jeremiah making the rounds on the talk shows and the YouTube podcasts and stuff talking about the scientific evidence, just go watch it. I mean, I've just taken all of this from those discussions. But the image on the shroud is a superficial image, only 0.2 micrometers deep on the topmost fibers, and it has a negative, like a photographic negative discovered in 1898. And three-dimensional, it is a three-dimensional image verified via VP8 image analyzer, showing the topographic encoding rather than paint or artistic distortion. Modern science cannot replicate it without scorching or chemicals, which would penetrate deeper. And Johnson cites physicist Paul DeLiso's calculations, forming the image would require a burst of energy equivalent to 14,000 excimer lasers, or a flash of light, possibly from the moment of resurrection, akin to a fall through where Jesus' body dematerialized through the cloth. So all that energy in less than, I think, 0.3 seconds, and it's an unfakeable image, and it contains a photo negative that wasn't discovered until 1898 and would have been completely unknown of in the 1st century, or even in the 14th century if it was a forgery. So then you have the blood stain and wound evidence. So it does in fact contain real human blood, type AB, preceding the image showing serum halos under UV light. Wounds match the gospel descriptions of scourging, 120 plus dumbbell-shaped marks from a Roman flagrum. It does have a crown of thorns, the nail wounds in the wrist, not palms, aligning with the anatomy to support body weight of a crucifixion. The side puncture, no blood flow post-mortem. So the blood that came out of the side puncture was all post-mortem wounds. Then there's also pollen from Judean plants and argonite soil, which confirms that it was a 1st century Middle Eastern origin. And then dirt in the nose area matches the sudarium of Ovida, another cloth with matching blood stains and AB type. So additionally, there's still more. You have no pigments or directionality. So the 1978 Shroud of Turin research project involving 40 scientists found no dyes, paints, or brushstrokes. The image has no directionality. It's not projected from one side. Recent studies, 2024 X-ray dating, suggest a 1st century origin, challenging the 1988 carbon dating of 1260 to 1390, which they say is because it was damaged in a fire and repaired, and the sample came from the repaired portion, which was added in the 1300s. Then you have resurrection implications. The image shows no decomposition, consistent with the New Testament story. The body wrapped for 40 plus hours per the Gospels, and directional distortion as if the cloth was vacuumed away, supporting a supernatural event. You have the provenance. It's traced to 1st century Jerusalem via the Mendelian image of Edessa, a folded shroud reference in early church texts like Eusebius. It matches dimensions and herringbone weave of wealthy 1st century linen per Joseph Arimathea's fine cloth. The face resembles the earliest non-medieval Jesus icons, not Renaissance art, and wide-angle X-ray scatter testing shows fiber decay consistent with the 2,000 years of degradation, dating it to the 1st century. So that's a lot of evidence for the Shroud of Turin being the burial cloth of Jesus and capturing the moment of his resurrection. Then you have the reliability of the New Testament documentation. So all the dating of the New Testament manuscripts, the earliest manuscripts, they were written between 50 and 100 CE. The earliest surviving fragments include Ryland's papyrus around 125 to 150 CE. So, within 50, 75 years or so is you have physical evidence of the original authorship. So we don't have the original works, but we have copies of things that are only 75 plus years older. A fragment of John found in Egypt also shows early circulation of the gospel, so the decentralization of the work the decentralization of the Gospels and the letters all over the place. So the fact that there was no centralized place where all of these things could be fiddled with or manipulated or tampered shows the consistency as well. Composition dates, scholarly consensus dates the New Testament books as follows. Between 50, the 50s CE basically. Synoptic Gospels 65 CE, Luke maybe 70 CE, John's maybe 90, and some of these are the late dates. So some suggest that the Gospels could have even been written even earlier than this. So I went with a conservative one. The absence of references to the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 EE and most New Testament texts suggests many were written before this event. So, like I said, the fact that this nuclear bomb going off in Israel, the destruction of Jerusalem, is never mentioned in any of these suggests that most of these were written before that happened. Then you have the textual reliability, the manuscript quantity. There's over 5,800 Greek New Testament manuscripts, 10,000 Latin, and thousands in other language, Coptic, Syriac, far surpassing any other ancient text. Homer's Iliad, for example, was 1,800. So at least 5 times more than number 2. Textual variants, while there are variants, spelling, word order, things like that, most are minor and none of them affect doctrine. All right, so again, we're going through this, we're building the mountain, we're looking at the mountain, right? So we see that there is pretty good evidence, both historically and archaeologically, for the preservation of the Old Testament, that the history and the archaeology aligns with what's written in the text. We know from the text that it is basically a profession of God, an attempt of God to communicate with people. He's sending them messages. He's teaching them about his nature, what he's like. So it doesn't prove God yet, right? It doesn't really prove God yet, but we know that it looks pretty reliable, and it looks like, if we can trust the reliability of that, then we can start to take seriously the claims of God in the Old Testament. Then we get into the New Testament, and we see, again, the history and the archaeology, very strong for the reliability of the text. Okay, well, what about the claims? What about the spiritual claims of God in the New Testament? Jesus comes down. He is God on earth. God on earth. And this is what he claims. He claims he is God on earth, and he has come to offer himself as a living sacrifice for sins so that we can be restored to a relationship with God. So what do we do with this? So how do we know for sure that he claimed to be God? And how do we know for sure that is a true claim? Well, we'll look at this HAAND acronym. I have a whole other video on this, so I'm just going to go over it in high level rather than in detail. But we know because Jesus routinely took honors upon himself reserved for God. He displayed attributes that only God could have. He had authority that only God could have. He took on the various names of God given from the Old Testament, and he performed the deeds of God, which testified to the people in the world around that he was in fact God. So what are those honors then? So here are several examples, verses where Jesus accepts both worship and prayer from people. Again, I'm not gonna read these. You can go back and look at them. But Matthew 14:33, Matthew 28:9, John 14:13 and 14, and John 16:23 and 24. In all those instances, accepting worship and accepting prayer from people is the exclusive honor and right of God, and yet Jesus takes them upon himself. Attributes. We see numerous attributes of God, eternal nature, omnipotence, and omniscience that Jesus takes upon himself. So John 1:1-3, we see that he was there in the beginning. The Word was with God, the Word was God, and through him all things were made. Before Abraham was born, I am. For in him all things were created, in heaven and earth, visible and invisible. I am the Alpha and the Omega, who is and who was. Now we can see you know all things. And then let all the churches know that I am he who searches hearts and minds. All of these things indicate that he is eternal, omnipotent, and omniscient. Then he takes upon himself the names and titles associated for the divine. So, for example, Philippians 2:9-11, God exalted him in the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name. Jesus replied, all you from now on, you will see the Son of Man, a title given to a divine figure prophesied in the Old Testament, his favorite title for himself. Messiah, he told the woman at the well that he was the Messiah. Also the Alpha and the Omega, which is obviously a title for God, the beginning and the end. Then he also did the deeds and had the authority of God. So his miracles testified about him that what he was saying is true, by forgiving sin, by mastery over nature, walking on the water, mastery over disease, healing blindness, paralytics, mute, deaf, mastery over death, raising Lazarus from the dead. And even the demons, the things that are in rebellion to God, kneeled before him and recognized that he was the Son of the Most High God. Only God could do those things. So now, if we have to take his claims seriously, because we know the Old Testament is reliable, we know the New Testament is reliable. If we know those things are reliable, and we now see that God is Jesus, and God is making certain claims about himself, about divinity and his mission and his purpose, we have to start taking that seriously. But do we really know for sure yet? And my contention would be that prophecy in the Bible confirms beyond a reasonable doubt that what he said is true and what he commanded is backed by the authority of God. So I did a personal review study of the entire Bible, and I came up with 389 total prophecies. I did a whole video on it, or I'm doing a whole video series on it, so you'll be able to see these. But out of those 389 total prophecies, there were 312 fulfilled prophecies, right? So things that have already been fulfilled in the Old Testament or the New Testament, which means there's still another 70 plus prophecies that are pending fulfillment at the end times. Working with AI, I've developed a confidence rating around each and every one of these prophecies about whether it was a clear prophecy, clearly understood as prophecy, had specific details in it that made it objectively testable, and that there was clear evidence that prophecy was fulfilled in exactly the way that it was laid out. And the rating system, the 5, was the highest level, and there were 54 of those prophecies. So of those 54 prophecies then, narrowing it down even further to say, well, do we have scripture, either fragments or full scripture, that we have in hand that we know predates the fulfillment of the scripture? The scripture was made, written down, that predates, we have it in hand, and then the prophecy was fulfilled. Of those, there were 10. So of the 10, then, you get down to 8 when you remove 2 duplicates. And this is where we know, beyond a shadow of a doubt, beyond a reasonable doubt, that the words of the Old Testament and the New Testament are true. Because the mathematical probability that all 8 prophecies are false is approximately 1 in 5.69 billion. This provides extremely strong evidence for historical accuracy of the predicted events and supports the theological truth of Christianity, particularly Jesus as a Messiah evidence. While not absolute proof, the data suggests a near certain likelihood, 99.99999, that Christianity's prophetic foundation is true. Now take this number and think back to the cosmological constants that we talked about and how absurdly mathematically precise they are. So a God that could create those absurdly mathematical precise constants to allow life to exist, who then gives us prophecy in the Old Testament and the New Testament so that we can see, we know that he's saying things that are going to happen in the future. Only God could see the future, could issue a prophecy. And not only did he make 389 of those over the last 6,000 years, but he left us enough evidence to know at least 8 of those are beyond a shadow of a doubt made and fulfilled, and the mathematical likelihood of just those 8 makes it a near certainty that it is true. So why does this matter? Why does all this matter? Okay, fine. The moral argument suggests there is a God. The philosophical arguments suggest that God is revealed in the nature of the universe itself. The scientific arguments show that there is strong evidence that we can study and see that shows that those arguments are in fact true and testable. Then we have the historical and archaeological evidence of God's intervention within the world that is also reliable. And we have the messages in the Bible itself. What is the message that God ultimately is trying to communicate to us? We are eternal creatures, either by design from God or simply because the Spirit must be eternal. We are eternal creatures. We were made explicitly for the purpose of having a relationship with God. And we screwed it up. We messed that up. And that relationship has been destroyed by sin, and we are subject to his righteous, perfect judgment. But God doesn't want that. He's demonstrated through history, through Scripture, through the sacrificial love of his Son, that he wants to rescue us from this eternal calamity. Because whatever it is about our souls, they are eternal. So we either go to heaven, restore our relationship with God, or we go to hell because there's nowhere else for us to go if we reject his gift. Rejection of this rescue mission. Jesus coming to earth was a rescue mission. It was a rescue mission. But rejection of this rescue mission has a twofold consequence: eternal separation from God and ongoing continuous judgment. And, possibly even worse, is the loss of gaining back our true nature and purpose in the restoration of a restored relationship to God. To understand ourselves, we are twisted and perverted and have lost our purpose and meaning because of sin, and that's not that's not conducive to us living in a fulfilled way. And if we reject it, we lose that and we face judgment. So if this is not compelling enough for you to come to the conclusion that it does matter, all of this matters very deeply and personally to both you and God, then I don't know what else I can tell you. But if it does matter, I just want to invite you to accept Christ as Lord and Savior. Revelations 3:20. Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come into him and will dine with him, and he with me. Christ is waiting for us. He's outside our door. He wants us to knock so he can open. That's what he wants. And it's as simple as Romans 10:9. If you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved.